There is a photograph taken in 1967 that most people who love Jim Morrison's music have never seen. It was not taken at a concert. It was not taken backstage or in a recording studio. It was taken at a family gathering, one of the rare occasions when Jim Morrison, the emerging cultural phenomenon, and George Stephen Morrison, his father, occupied the same room at the same time. In the photograph, they are standing perhaps 3 feet apart. They are not touching. They are not looking at each other. And the distance between them, 3 feet of charged and silent air, tells a story that the music never quite told directly, though it was always somewhere inside it. This is that story. Jim Morrison spent his entire life writing about fathers and sons without ever resolving what he felt about his own. He circled the subject in his poetry, approached it from oblique angles in his lyrics, pressed against it in the long spoken word pieces he performed in concert. He was drawn to mythology, partly because mythology gave him a language for dynamics he could not address directly. The authority of the father, the rebellion of the son, the long and painful process by which a person separates from the person who made them and discovers what they are on their own terms. The Greeks understood this. Rimbaud understood it. Jim understood it in the way that people understand things they have lived rather than merely studied. The father, George Stephen Morrison, was a man defined by structure. A career Navy officer who rose to the rank of admiral, he believed in systems, in hierarchy, in the kind of disciplined progress that military life rewards. He was not cruel. He was not absent in the basic physical sense, but he was absent in the way that men of his generation and his formation were taught to be absent, emotionally unavailable in a manner so thoroughgoing that it was not experienced as withholding but simply as the natural condition of fathers. This was how fathers were. This was what fathers did. They provided and they protected, and they maintained the structure within which the family functioned. What they did not do generally was ask their children what they were feeling or why. Jim was the eldest child, which meant he bore the full weight of his father's expectations without the buffer of older siblings who might have absorbed some of that pressure first. He was expected to be excellent. He was expected to pursue a career that reflected well on the family name. He was expected, in the deepest possible sense, to be a version of his father, slightly updated, slightly improved, but recognizably continuous with the lineage that George Morrison had built his life around representing. Instead, Jim became Jim Morrison, and the distance between those two outcomes was the defining wound of both their lives. Early roots, the early years carried the particular texture of military childhood. Constant relocation, new schools, the need to reconstruct a self from scratch every time the family moved. Jim was smart enough that the academic transitions were not the problem. The social transitions were harder. He was always the new kid, always the outsider, always the one who arrived with no established relationships and had to find his footing in a social landscape that had already organized itself without him. He responded by retreating inward into books and ideas and the private world of his own imagination, where the constant disruptions of external life could not reach. His father interpreted this retreat as aloofness, possibly as laziness. Jim interpreted his father's interpretation as evidence that they were speaking fundamentally different languages, and that neither had any particular interest in learning the other's. The standoff was polite, as these things tend to be in military families, where the maintenance of surface order is itself a form of discipline. But it was real, and it deepened with every year that passed without either of them finding a way across it. By the time Jim arrived at UCLA's film school in 1964, the distance had calcified into something that both of them had stopped expecting to change. George Morrison had stopped expecting his eldest son to conform to the path he had imagined for him. Jim had stopped expecting his father to understand what he was actually doing with his life, or why. They occupied parallel existences that intersected occasionally at family gatherings, where the conversation was managed and the silences were filled with the specific noise of people who have agreed, without articulating the agreement, not to say the things that would make the silence worse. Jim met Ray Manzarek on a Venice Beach rooftop that summer. He sang the words he had been writing in private, and Manzarek heard the music inside them before Jim had fully recognized it himself. The Doors were born, and with their birth came something Jim had not fully anticipated: the possibility that his private language, the language of his notebooks, his poetry, his most interior self, might find an audience. might matter to people who had never met him and would never meet him, might do in the world what his actual voice had never managed to do in the Morrison family living room. The Silence That Fame Couldn't Fill the Doors released their debut album in January 1967. Light My Fire reached #1. Break On Through announced a new kind of rock intelligence, stranger, more psychologically dense, more willing to go to the places where most popular music declined to venture. Jim's voice carried the weight of everything he had been reading and thinking and feeling since adolescence, and audiences recognized something in it that they had not heard before. Not simply talent, not simply charisma, something more specific. The sound of a person who had genuine questions and was unwilling to pretend they had been answered. George Morrison did not call. This is the fact around which everything else in this story organizes itself. When his eldest son became one of the most famous musicians in America, when his face appeared on the cover of magazines, and his voice filled arenas, and his name became a kind of cultural shorthand for an entire generation's restlessness, George Morrison did not call to say, "I heard what you made. I was wrong about what you were capable of. I understand you differently now." He did not call because he did not know how to make that call, because the language required for that call was not a language he had ever been taught to speak. Because admirals don't make calls like that, and George Morrison was, in the deepest and most irreducible sense, an admiral. Jim knew his father was not calling. He tracked the silence, the way you track the silence of someone you have been waiting for, with a combination of resigned expectation and the specific hurt of hope repeatedly deferred. He didn't talk about it publicly. He deflected biographical questions with philosophical ones, turned interviews about his childhood into meditations on myth and consciousness, found a way to discuss everything except the particular man in Melbourne, Florida, who had raised him in a house full of order and structure, and the particular silence of a father who did not know how to see his son clearly. But the silence showed up in the music. It showed up in the way Jim sang about authority and its limits, about the father figure as both origin and obstacle, about the desperate human desire to be known by the people who made you. It showed up in the end, that 11-minute meditation on severance and transformation that became one of the Doors' most powerful pieces, whose mythological dimensions were real and deliberate, and also simultaneously a piece about a specific boy and a specific father and the specific father and the specific failure of understanding between them that had shaped everything Jim Morrison had ever felt about himself. The Fame years, the years between 1967 and 1970, were not a period of reconciliation between Jim and his father. They were a period of intensification, of everything that was already true becoming more dramatically and publicly true, the private distance becoming visible to anyone who looked closely at the shape of Jim's art. Jim gave interviews in which he referred to his parents as dead, not as a statement of literal fact, but as a statement of psychological reality. They had died to him as the parents he had needed them to be. And what remained was a polite fiction maintained at family gatherings where the television played in the background, and no one said anything that mattered. George Morrison, for his part, maintained the fiction with the same precision he brought to everything else. He was proud, in some complicated way he was not equipped to express, of his son's success. He kept track of the albums, of the press coverage, of the trajectory of a career he had never understood and had opposed, and that had turned out to be real and significant in ways he had not predicted. He did not know how to reconcile the Jim Morrison on the magazine covers with the Jim Morrison he had raised. He did not know how to acknowledge that the distance between them had been, at least partly, a function of his own limitations. So he maintained the distance, because maintenance was what he knew how to do. There was a phone call in 1969 to Jim was in Los Angeles, deep in the complicated aftermath of the Miami concert that had set in motion the final chapter of his American life. What was said in that call is not matters of public record. What is known is that it was brief, and that it did not result in the conversation that needed to happen between them. It was two men performing civility at each other across a distance that neither of them knew how to close. Paris, the understanding that came too late. Jim Morrison went to Paris in March 1971. He went to write, to think, to find the version of himself that existed when the machinery of fame was not present to organize everything around the image it had constructed. He walked along the Seine with Pamela Corson, He sat in cafes and read and wrote in the small notebooks he had always carried. He was quieter than he had been in years, and the people who knew him in Paris described a man in the process of becoming someone new, or perhaps someone very old, the person he had been before the rock and roll machinery had gotten hold of him and turned him into a symbol. He wrote about his father in those Paris notebooks. Not with anger. The anger had belonged to an earlier period, a period of pushing against the walls to see if they would give. What he wrote in Paris was something more complicated and more honest than anger. It was the writing of a person who had begun to understand his father not as an antagonist, but as another human being shaped by forces that had nothing to do with Jim. Forces that had produced, in George Morrison, a man incapable of certain kinds of expression. Not because he didn't feel the corresponding things, but because no one had ever given him permission or language for feeling them. This is perhaps the hardest understanding to arrive at, the understanding of your parents as people rather than simply as parents, as individuals with their own formations and their own wounds and their own unresolved distances from their own fathers. Jim arrived at it in Paris, in the mornings before the city woke, in the particular quality of light that enters the windows of certain apartments and makes everything feel both more real and more provisional than it seemed the day before. He never got to tell his father what he had understood. The aftermath. Jim Morrison died on July 3, 1971. He was 27 years old. He died in the Paris apartment he shared with Pamela Corson, in the city he had chosen as the place where he might finally become, outside the noise of fame and myth, the person his notebooks had always described. George Morrison received the news in the way that parents receive such news suddenly, and in a way that reorganizes everything that came before it into a sequence that now has a different meaning. He did not speak publicly about his son's death for a long time. When he did speak, eventually, in interviews given years later, when he had retired from the Navy and the mythology around Jim had already begun its long process of accumulation. What he said was careful and measured and revealed, between its careful, measured lines, the shape of everything he had not said while Jim was alive. He said he had been proud of his son. He said he had not always understood what Jim was doing, but that he had come over time to understand that it mattered, to Jim and to the people who connected with it. He said he wished he had found a way to tell Jim that. He said he wished he had found the words earlier, when there was still time for the words to arrive and be received, and to change something between them. He said this quietly, in the way that people speak about irreversible things, not with drama, but with the specific weight of regret that has had years to settle into something permanent. The telephone that had rung too infrequently when Jim was alive could not ring now. Legacy George Morrison did not distance himself from Jim's legacy. He engaged with it, carefully, in his own way, with the same measured attention he brought to everything. He visited the grave at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. The grave had become, by the late 1970s, one of the most visited in the world, covered in flowers and photographs and the handwritten notes of people who had never met Jim Morrison but who had found something in his music that they needed. George Morrison stood at that grave, an admiral surrounded by the evidence of what his son had been to a world that had understood Jim in ways the family had not. And whatever he felt standing there was something he kept private. It belonged to him and to the grave and to the distance between them that the grave had made permanent. The Doors' music remains alive in ways that continue to confound easy explanation. People who were not yet born when Jim Morrison died discover Light My Fire or Riders on the Storm or the End and feel something move in them. Not nostalgia, since you cannot be nostalgic for something you never experienced, but recognition. The recognition of someone asking the questions you have been carrying without knowing how to articulate them. The recognition of a voice that knows the distance between what is felt and what can be said, and refuses to pretend that distance doesn't exist. That refusal, to pretend the distance doesn't exist, was the thing that made Jim Morrison an artist rather than simply a performer. It was the thing his father could not give him permission for, because George Morrison had built his life on exactly the opposite principle, that the maintenance of structure required the suppression of certain distances, certain acknowledgments, certain forms of honesty that threaten the order of things. Jim's art was, among other things, a sustained argument against that principle. It was his father's son saying, in every song and every poem and every performance, the distance is real, and pretending it isn't is the most dangerous form of dishonesty available to us. George Morrison outlived his son by decades. He died in 28, at the age of 89. By the time he died, Jim Morrison had been a cultural icon for nearly 40 years. The Admiral's obituaries mentioned his son. They always did. But they also described a man who had commanded the naval forces of the United States, who had served with distinction, who had lived by the codes he believed in. A man who had been, in the ways he knew how to be, exactly what he set out to be. Two men. The same blood. Languages that had never fully translated into each other, across a distance that neither of them had chosen and neither of them had managed to close, and that the grave had eventually made the only kind of permanent that has no appeal available. But here is what the distance did not prevent. The music. The notebooks. The poetry. The sustained and urgent and deeply human project of a person trying to understand what it means to be alive in a world full of fathers and sons who cannot find the words. Jim Morrison made that project into art that has outlasted every prediction, that continues to find new listeners in new decades, that carries something true about human experience that does not diminish with the passage of time. He never heard his father say, "I understand what you were doing and it matters, and I'm proud of you in the way you needed me to be proud." That phone call never came. The words were never said in the form that would have meant the most. And the distance between them, 3 feet of charged and silent air in a 1967 photograph, remained the defining space of both their lives. But Jim Morrison filled that distance with everything he had. With every song and every poem and every performance that pushed past what was comfortable and expected, into the territory where the real things live. He filled it with the end, and light my fire and riders on the storm, and with the notebooks in Paris that no one was supposed to read. He filled it with the searching that never stopped, because the searching was the most honest response he had to the silence where his father's voice should have been. That is the truest thing about Jim Morrison. Not the mythology, not the leather jacket, not the stage presence that made thousands feel they were watching something unprecedented. The truest thing is that he took a silence, the particular silence of a father who did not know how to see his son, and turned it into music that helped millions of people feel less alone in their own silences. That transmutation, from personal wound to universal expression, is what artists do when they are working at the level Jim Morrison was working. And it is why the music still matters, and why the distance in that 1967 photograph still carries weight, and why the story of these two men, the Admiral and the poet, the father and the son, the one who maintained the structure and the one who set fire to it, is not finished yet.